Hi, welcome to Perp Miniatures. I'm going to be kit-bashing a Goliath Forge Tyrant. I started with a Tau stealth suit body, but wanted to bulk it out a bit since the stealth suit was not as wide as a normal Goliath body. To do this, I traced the shape of the stealth suit on a plasticard sheet and cut them out with my X-Acto blade. The plan for this kit bash is that this Forge Tyrant found some Xenos tech on a ship that crashed down onto Necromunda, so he's going to have a bit more of a strange techie feel. Once the plasticard sheets were cut out, I glued them together and then glued the stealth suit onto either side and left that to dry. Once that sat for a while, I trimmed as much of the excess plasticard as I could by cutting and scraping with my X-Acto blade. After that was all cleaned up, I moved on to an idea I had that on this spaceship the Forge Tyrant found, there was a hall of marble statues that this Goliath thought were angels, so he took the face of one to wear as a mask. To start the mask, I took a bit from a stone face basing kit made by Bad Squiddo Games and cut the excess resin off, so I was left with just the face. This face part will change quite a bit throughout the build at various points since it ended up being a hard point to get right. Next, I trimmed the back of the face with my X-Acto blade so it would sit closer to the body. Then I glued the face on with some super glue. This part will change at a later step in the process. I wanted this model to be equipped with a bolt gun, and since it's the leader of the gang, I wanted his gun to be beefier than normal. So I started by trimming off the magazine of the bolt gun from the Goliath gang kit to make room to add extra parts to it. First, I added a muzzle from a Horus Heresy Contemptor Dreadnought. After checking how it would fit to the bolt gun, I trimmed the original barrel down so the front of the gun was flat, and made a small trim to the Dreadnought barrel so it sat flat as well, and glued the two parts together with some plastic glue. Next, I saw a flamer on the Contemptor Dreadnought sprue that I thought could look cool under the barrel of the bolt gun. So I cut the nozzle from the flamer and glued the two parts together, then checked the fit against the bolt gun. After making some adjustments to the two parts by scraping with my X-Acto blade, I glued them together using some sprue goo. I wanted to bulk out the gun a bit, so I took a part from a Space Marine Stormhawk interceptor, clipping it down the seam and testing its fit. Then I trimmed those pieces down until they sat well against the bolt gun, and glued them to either side with some sprue goo. Now that the bolt gun was in a good place, I tested the fit of the arm against the body, and found that the arm had a really awkward fit, and I needed to make some changes. The first thing I tried was to see if I cut just the round parts on top and front of the stealth suit from the rest of the torso, if that would fit well against a normal Goliath body. So I cut a body from the Goliath gang kit from the sprue to test it side by side. The Goliath body turned out to be too small, so I checked my bits box and found this Auric Warclan's Brute body, which ended up being a great fit. Now that I had that figured out, I started cutting the stealth suit apart using my hobby saw to get the majority cut away, and cleaned up the cut with my X-Acto blade afterwards. To fit the piece against the Orc torso, I had to cut a big part of the body away with my clippers, but it would all be covered up by the suit of armor. Before I glued these pieces together, I decided to scrape away at some of the more orky armor that the torso came with, since it had much more of a crude feel than I wanted, and this would be much harder to do once the armor piece was glued on. Once that was done, I glued the armor piece to the torso using some sprue goo. With the body being bigger now, I tested the fit of the gun arm and found that the Goliath arm was too small compared to the Orc torso. So I started looking for different options for the arm, ending up with the Orc arm that came with the body. The Orc arm was holding a sword though, so I clipped the sword off just above the hand and scraped that flat. Next, I cut the bolt gun from the Goliath arm by clipping at the hand. I checked the fit of these two parts and made some small adjustments by scraping with my X-Acto blade. Then I drilled holes for pinning and glued them together. Before I attached the arm to the body, I went in and scraped away at the nails on the hand. Since this was an Orc hand, its nails were really long and looked almost like claws, which didn't fit the feel for this Goliath. Then I checked the fit of the arm against the body and made some small cuts to the torso so the arm could sit in the right position. Once I was happy with the fit, I glued the arm into place, making some small adjustments while the glue dried so it looked like he was pointing the bolt gun forward rather than down. For his right arm, I wanted the leader to be wielding a chain axe, and after having to switch out the arm with the bolt gun previously for a bigger arm, I started this time with an Orc arm wielding a pole weapon. I had a bit from a Space Marine Centurion assault squad that I thought looked a bit like an engine, and was about the right size for a big chain axe, fit for a Goliath forge boss. Before I started cutting too much though, I wanted to test some more parts with it, so I clipped 2 chain swords from the World Eater Jackal's kit that had just about the same profile, and checked them against this engine bit. I was happy with how it looked, so I started trimming away. First at the chain swords. I wanted the 2 chain swords to sit side by side to make the chain axe head, but there were some parts that stuck out and made the connection weird, so I trimmed that flat. After that, the engine bit had some parts that stuck out, making it hard for the chain swords to sit flat against it, so I clipped those off and scraped that side flat with my X-Acto blade. Now that I was happy with how the chain swords sat against the engine part, I glued them together with some plastic glue, making sure that both chain swords lined up with each other. I wanted to add something more that gave the weapon more of an axe appearance, which I think of as having a curve along the head of the axe, so I clipped a shoulder pad from the Goliath gang kit and checked it against the chain axe. I made some adjustments to both parts by cutting and scraping with my X-Acto blade until the shoulder pad sat well against the chain axe, and then I glued the 2 pieces together with some plastic glue. Next, I checked the chain axe head against the polearm bit I planned on using and found a good place to cut the blade off. So I clipped the blade there, and again checked it against the chain axe head. I was happy with how the 2 parts fit together, so I drilled holes for pinning and glued the parts together. Before gluing the arm on, I went in again and trimmed the clawed nails from the hand so it felt less orky. I checked how the axe arm would sit against the body and made some adjustments by clipping part of the body away, and then glued the arm on using some sprue glue, adding in a bit of plastic glue where the handle of the axe sat against one of the legs. I moved on now to the armor. There were some substantial gaps between the armor and the body that I wanted to fill in, and I wanted to make some adjustments to the statue face on the front. While I had been building this model, I realized that there wasn't enough space in the armor for the Goliath's head to fit, so I wanted to bulk out the top of the armor a bit. I started this by taking another piece from the Contemptor Dreadnought kit and checked how it would fit along the top of the armor. It initially sat too high, so I made some cuts to the bottom of this piece so it would sit flat against the stone face. Then I glued it into place with some sprue glue, adding in some plastic glue where points touched the armor for a better connection. Next, I took a bit from the Contemptor Dreadnought and clipped what would have been the front armor around the Dreadnought's head away, so I was left with just the top part. I then checked if this part would slot into the back of the armor, and the fit was pretty good, but needed some adjustments. So I made some cuts with my X-Acto blade, trying to carve out portions where the arms of the body sat against this armor piece. Once it fit well, I glued it into place. At this point, I realized that the stone face was too big and was sitting too low, which made the entire model look goofy. So I went back to the stone face basing kit from earlier and found this face that was broken in half, which was a little smaller than the original face. I wanted to fill out the other half of the face with some techie bits so it would have a better connection back to the armor. The first bit I tested was from a Tau Pathfinder Kill Team drone, which I thought looked like it could be some sort of eyepiece. I made some cuts with my X-Acto blade so that this eyepiece would sit flat against the stone face. Before I glued the pieces together, I realized that this face piece was too thick and would sit off the body too far, so I grabbed my hobby saw and cut a large piece of the model away, doing the same for the eyepiece so that both parts were about the same thickness. Then I glued them together with some super glue. To fill out the rest of the face, I took another piece from the Contemptor Dreadnought, this time a finger. The piece fit well on the face, so I glued it on as is with some super glue, adding a bit of plastic glue where it touched the eyepiece. Now that I was happy with how the new face was looking, I removed the old face by cutting it off with my X-Acto blade, being careful not to damage another part of the model. I clipped the piece from the Contemptor Dreadnought that was on top of the body, so it was flat, and so the new face could sit against it without too much of a gap. Then I checked the fit of the new face and made some small adjustments before gluing it into place with some super glue. After I left that to dry and came back to the model, I was still not quite happy with the face. It felt too heavy, so again I cut the face from the body. To make the face thinner, I took a piece of sandpaper and sanded the backside down until I was happy with how far off the body would sit. I cleaned up the front of the model and made some small adjustments to the top piece of the armor so it sat a little bit lower as well. Then I superglued the face back onto the model. To bulk out the armor a bit more, I took this bit from an old drop pod and cut the upper harness pieces and tube part away, so I was left with just the belt piece. I was careful not to damage the other harness pieces as I would be using them later in the build. I checked the fit against the belt area of the model and glued this piece into place. I wanted the leader of my Goliath gang to have a mohawk to match his station, so I took this helmet from the Fyreslayer's Volkite Berserker's kit and glued together the champion's helmet, which had a dual mohawk coming out of the top. Once that had dried a bit, I cut the helmet away, leaving just the mohawks. I also trimmed away the dragon iconography, since that was a bit too ornate for what I was going for. I checked the fit of the mohawk against the head of the model, and then glued it on using a lot of sprue goo to fill in the gap left by the underside of the mohawk. I'll fill this in more later as well. While this was still drying, I tried my best to make sure it was straight in line with the face below. Going back to the armor, I took another bit from the Contemptor Dreadnought and checked how it would look along the back of the armor. I cut the bit in half with my clippers and also trimmed part of the side that would sit against the back of the model so that it sat flat. Then I glued this piece into place with some plastic glue. I found some bits on the Contemptor Dreadnought sprue that I liked and thought could look like vents for the armor, so I clipped them out. While I was trying to see how they looked on the model, it was really fiddly, so I grabbed some poster tack and temporarily attached the vents with that so I could see how they looked. Once I had an idea of how they would attach best, I took the vents off and cleaned up the poster tack. Then I trimmed the vents with my X-Acto blade, so they sat a bit better against the armor. I glued them to the armor using some sprue goo since there would still be substantial gaps between the parts and I wanted to fill some of that in. I'll do some more filling of these parts later as well. While the sprue goo was still drying, I did my best to line up the vents so they sat roughly the same against the armor. Next, I thought the toe sections of the Contemptor Dreadnought could look like some chunky pauldrons for the armor, so I checked how they would fit against the model. I had to cut a decent chunk out of the bottom of the toe part so they would sit better against the shoulders of the model. I cut into this with my clippers to get the majority of the plastic away, and then trimmed with my X-Acto blade to make the cut look cleaner. I checked the fit again, and saw I had to cut away part of the shoulder pad that stuck out further than the rest of the piece, so it sat a bit closer to the armor. Once I was happy with the result, I glued the shoulder pad to the armor using some plastic glue, doing my best to line up the shoulder pad with the arms below. There was a bag attached to the belt of the model that was going to be in the way for the next step, so I trimmed that off and scraped the area flat. Then I checked the harness pieces I cut away from the drop pod piece earlier. I was pretty happy with how they sat, so I put down some sprue goo around the belt line of the model and glued the harness pieces into place. I thought this looked like some sort of harness for the armor itself and did a good job of bridging the front of the armor to the backside. The connection of all the parts on the back were a bit rough, so I found another bit from the Contemptor Dreadnought to cover that mess up, gluing this piece into place with some plastic glue. I also filled in the front of the armor a bit more with another piece from the Contemptor Dreadnought, cutting the bit flat and gluing it into place to cover up a gap between the armor and the belt. I was happy with where the model was at, so I decided it was time to fill in all the gaps that had been left behind. So I mixed up some green stuff and milliput in equal parts. Then I filled in the gaps of the model by pushing a bit of this mixture into a gap and smoothing it out with a sculpting tool. I made sure to have a little bit of water on the end of the tool so it didn't stick to the green stuff mixture. I left the green stuff mixture to dry overnight, then came back and scraped all of the gap filling flat with the edge of my X-Acto blade. For the base, I wanted this Goliath to be around some industrial looking pieces for part of his backstory. To start, I had a bit from a Space Marine ironclad dreadnought that fit on the base pretty well, so I glued it down with some plastic glue. Then I cut part of a plastic card I-beam and glued that to the base with some plastic glue at an angle so it wasn't in line with the dreadnought bit. After that, I cut a piece of plastic card tube to about the same size. I thought it could be some sort of wire conduit, so I cut into the side of the tube to make an opening. Once that was cut, I took some florist wire I had twisted together to look like cabling and cut a piece from it. I unwound one side of it to make the wires look frayed on one end and then glued the non-frayed end into the plastic card tube with some super glue. Then I went through with my clippers and cut all of the parts that were hanging off the side of the base. Now the base was done, so I attached the model to the base by testing the standing position of the model. Then I drilled holes for pinning and glued the model down to the base. And with that, the model is complete. While I show the painting of the model, I'll be reading out this model's backstory. The story of Hullbreach Starborn. Born into the absolute chaos of warning lights and klaxons blaring, some lapse in the ship's power grid tripped the amnio vat in the cargo holds. Out came a screaming hulk of a life form. His senses slowly came to him. Air, cold and stale. Cargo scattered all around from the jostling of the ship. Warning lights flashing all around, and the repeated message playing from overhead.
Hullbreach. Warning. Hullbreach.
A second later, the artificial gravity of the ship failed, and the Goliath experienced the gut-churning sense of 0 Gs. After vomiting whatever chems were in his system, he was propelled in an arc that left him spinning through the cargo holds. He eventually managed to grab onto something sturdy and right himself. Making his way out of the cargo bay, he found himself in a corridor with some portholes looking out into space. As warnings continued,
Warning. Hullbreach. Warning. Hullbreach. Warning.
the Goliath pulled himself along the corridor, but was quickly stopped by the sights outside of the ship. A massive structure hung in orbit above the planet, a hive city in its own right, suspended in midair. Then, a blast of light emerged from the structure and barreled towards the ship that the Goliath was aboard. Moments later, everything shook furiously. The hive city in the sky disappeared from view as the ship began to fall towards the planet below. Soon, everything around the Goliath began glowing red, heating as the planet grew larger through the porthole. He retreated away from the pain of the superheated metal, eventually finding himself in a room full of marble statues lining both sides of the walls. Suddenly, he was sent tumbling towards one end of the room as the ship made contact with the wastes of the planet. The Goliath was knocked unconscious. Waking sometime later, the Goliath pushed his way from the rubble of the statues. A startled figure ran for cover within the room but soon stopped, staring back at him. Before him, another of his kind, but misshapen. This Goliath was hunchbacked and had a cage of sorts protruding from the side of his head, covering what looked to be his brain. When the big Goliath just stood and stared at this misshapen figure, the hunchbacked Goliath looked curiously back at him, before slinking away further into the ship. The big Goliath made his way out from the wreck and emerged onto an open wasteland in the dead of night. He quickly focused, though, on all of the lights in the sky above. Each one must be a hive city like he had seen just before the ship began to fall. There must have been at least 4 of them up there. As he kneeled in the ash, looking to the sky in amazement, he didn't realize the hunchbacked figure sneaking up behind him. The misshapen Goliath shoved something into the base of his skull, and information flooded into his system. Suddenly, he understood what he was, a Goliath, big and strong. After the pain of the data transfer subsided, the big Goliath got to his feet and looked at the hunchbacked figure. The figure spoke for the first time.
The others call me Brain. What should I call you?
Thinking it over for a few long moments, the big Goliath thought back to his first moments outside of the amnio vat.
Hullbreach.
Over time, Hullbreach and Brain picked through the wreckage of the ship, finding all manner of strange technology, some of which Hullbreach rigged into a suit of armor for himself. Taking parts from the broken marble statues for themselves, they fashioned masks and armor from the carved stone. As they established a stronghold within the wrecked ship, Hullbreach started attracting all manner of Goliath to his side. Soon, the story of a Goliath born aboard a falling star stretched out into the wastes, and Hullbreach Starborn had made a name for himself around Helmar's graveyard. Still, when Hullbreach had a clear enough night, he would look once again to the sky above, swearing to himself he would one day make it to the hive city he saw above the planet. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed your time here, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.